Imagine this for a second. Someone here in the U.S., maybe even a citizen, gets picked up.
Okay.
And for reasons that aren't, totally clear, they're shipped off to a prison in another country,
Wow.
possibly for life. It sounds, well, unbelievable, doesn't it?
It really does.
But that's kind of the shocking territory we're exploring today. We're
Yeah.
doing a deep dive into these revived agreements, the ones between the Trump administration and El Salvador.
And the deeply unsettling questions they bring up.
Exactly. Questions about who really is protected by American law anymore.
And to help us unpack all this complexity, we're drawing on two key pieces by Seth Abramson.
Right. The ones titled America is Back in the Slave Trade and the Trump-El Salvador Scandal Deepens.
Yeah, and these aren't just news reports. They offer a really sharp, critical analysis of what these agreements might actually mean.
So our mission for this deep dive really is to cut through all the noise. We want to understand the core elements of these deals, the intense controversy around them.
And what it all boils down to, for individual rights and how the U.S. is acting globally without getting lost in every single detail.
Okay, let's dive in then. These Trump-Bukele Accords, it wasn't just one single agreement, was it? There were a couple versions.
That's correct. Yeah, the first one emerged during President Trump's first term.
Okay.
It revolved around this idea of a safe third country, STC they often call it.
STC, right. And the basic idea there is what?
Well, the principle is that one country can say, look, this other country, not your home country, is safe enough for you to seek asylum there.
Gotcha.
But the big controversy even then was the U.S. under Trump aiming to send deportees to El Salvador.
El Salvador, which even at the time had massive safety issues, right?
Yeah.
Especially under President Bukele.
Exactly. Bukele is the leader down there who's, well, taken a very firm grip. Some call it authoritarian.
That's putting it mildly, maybe.
Perhaps. I mean, look, his time in power has seen crime rates drop, and there's been some economic improvement, apparently. But it's come alongside really serious worries about civil liberties just vanishing in El Salvador.
So even with that first deal, people were asking, is El Salvador really safe?
Absolutely. There were significant doubts it met the criteria. And as you mentioned, President Biden eventually pulled the U.S. out of that first accord.
Okay, but then January 2025 rolls around, the Trump administration is in.
And they bring it back.
Is it just the same deal dusted off?
Well, Abramson's analysis argues, no, it's not just a simple repeat.
How so?
He suggests these new agreements, and notice he uses the plural, agreements have kind of morphed.
Into something different.
Yeah, something fundamentally different from a standard STC setup. Because a deal had existed before, maybe its return didn't set off immediate alarm bells.
Like it should have.
Perhaps. But Abramson argues the potential scale, the impact under a second Trump term, with more time to really build these out, it's much bigger.
And raises more serious flags.
Much more serious red flags, yes.
So it's not just about asylum seekers anymore. Is that the implication?
That seems to be a really critical distinction here. Abramson's work points to what look like three separate types of deals operating sort of simultaneously.
Even if the administration isn't clearly labeling them.
Exactly. They don't seem to consistently differentiate. So you've got the original STC deal for asylum seekers.
Okay.
Then there's something called the FTO deal, FTO, likely for foreign terrorist organization, maybe.
And who does that target?
It's understood to target people the U.S. alleges are foreign-born gang members already inside the U.S.
Okay, alleged gang members. And the third?
And this is perhaps the most shocking one. The BOP deal, likely Bureau of Prisons.
Bureau of Prisons. Wait, does that mean?
It appears to involve U.S. citizens, people currently incarcerated in U.S. federal prisons.
Hold on. Sending U.S. citizens to prisons in El Salvador, that sounds legally impossible.
It definitely sets off a lot of legal alarm bells. Major ones.
Like what specifically?
Well, as Abramson points out, everyone under U.S. jurisdiction is protected by the Eighth Amendment.
Cruel and unusual punishment.
Right. Which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Sending anyone, especially citizens, to a place like CICOT in El Salvador.
CICOT being the specific prison facility.
Yes, the Center for the Confinement of Terrorism. Given the reported conditions, sending people there would almost certainly be seen as violating that core protection.
And beyond the Eighth Amendment.
Well, just the basic idea of the U.S. government shipping its own citizens off to be imprisoned in another country.
It raises huge questions.
Profound questions about sovereignty, the government's duty to its citizens. It seems fundamentally wrong.
Let's talk about CICOT then. The sources, Abramson's pieces, They paint a really grim picture.
Extremely grim. It's reportedly designed for life sentences, the implication being, once you go in, you're likely not coming out alive.
Just horrific.
And the overcrowding is described as severe. We're talking, in some cases, maybe 100 men crammed into one cell.
100. How much space is that per person?
Incredibly limited. The reporting suggests less than 2 cubic feet per person, like standing room only, basically.
And they're locked down almost constantly.
Yeah, the figure cited is 47 out of every 48 hours, just stuck in that cell.
What about basic conditions? Beds? Light?
Apparently, no beds, no mattresses, no furniture at all. And the lights are on 24/7, constant artificial light.
Anytime outside? Recreation? Visitors?
None. No recreation, no outdoor time, no educational programs, nothing like that. And crucially, no visitors. No contact with the outside world.
It sounds like sensory deprivation almost. What about personal items? Hygiene?
Inmates reportedly have 0 personal belongings. Toilets are open right there in the cell. They share water from a single jug. You can imagine the hygiene risks.
Unbelievable. And this isn't just for, like, convicted terrorists.
No, and that's a crucial, disturbing point Abramson makes. These conditions apply to everyone in Siakat.
Everyone. Including
people just awaiting trial, innocent people maybe swept up in mass arrests, people held for minor offenses, or things that aren't even really crimes.
Like the example from the New Yorker piece?
Exactly. That chilling story about a guy arrested for illegal gathering just because he was eating pupusas on the street with friends.
It feels like Bukele's approach isn't about punishing past crimes, but preventing future ones.
That seems to be the philosophy, yes. The Minority Report comparison in the source material feels disturbingly apt.
Arresting people based on what you think they might do.
Precisely. Preemptive arrests, targeting people based on perceived future risk, without real due process, treating whole groups as potential criminals based on, well, flimsy data.
It's dystopian.
It really is. And you have to assume that kind of thinking would easily extend to migrants who haven't been, thoroughly vetted or just get swept up.
So, okay, we have these 3 potential deals, STC, FTO, BOP, and then these brutal conditions in Siakat. Where does it all get legally and ethically tangled, according to the sources?
Well, a huge part of the problem is the lack of clear separation between these categories by the administration and by Bukele.
It's all blurred together.
It seems deliberately blurred, yes. The rhetoric often conflates nonviolent migrants with violent criminals. Anyone labeled a gang member is treated as dangerous regardless of their actual record.
Right.
And we even see minor property damage if linked to political opponents getting framed as terrorism.
So it's a strategy to paint anyone they want to remove as a major threat.
It certainly looks that way. It justifies the action.
And how does this connect to custody? Physical versus legal.
Yes, that's critical. When the U.S. sends someone to Siakat, they're handing over physical control, obviously.
Who has legal control?
That's the multi-million-dollar question. Bukele's government seems to operate as if they have both physical and legal custody.
And they're not likely to just hand legal authority back to U.S. courts if asked.
Highly unlikely. Which creates this massive constitutional and custodial crisis, particularly for U.S. citizens sent under that potential BOP deal.
How can a U.S. court protect its own citizen in a foreign prison if it has no legal standing there?
Exactly. It seems like they couldn't effectively intervene.
The case of Abrego Garcia really highlights this whole mess, doesn't it?
It's a powerful, deeply disturbing illustration of how things can go terribly wrong, even outside those 3 specific deal structures.
Remind us who he is.
Abrego Garcia is a legal U.S. resident. And the irony is he himself was a victim of MS-13 gang violence.
Okay.
He was mistakenly deported to El Salvador, not under STC, not FTO, not BOP. It was just an error.
An error. And how do the courts react?
The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals used incredibly strong language. They called what the administration did an official kidnapping.
Official kidnapping. Why?
And unconscionable. They didn't mince words.
So the administration admitted the mistake and brought him back?
No, that's the shocking part. They refused to facilitate his return.
Why on earth not?
Their stated reason was concern about the potential political damage it could cause President Bukele.
Wait. They prioritized Bukele's political image over a legal U.S. resident wrongly deported.
That's what the reporting indicates. It's an astonishing admission. It shows where the priorities lay.
Even after it was proven to be a mistake?
Yes. Even after a Department of Justice attorney, Erez Ruveni, explicitly admitted in court that Garcia's deportation was a clear error.
What happened to that attorney?
He was reportedly placed on indefinite leave almost immediately after making that admission.
That sends a chilling message.
It certainly suggests a profound reluctance to acknowledge mistakes and a disregard for due process.
And the terrible irony you mentioned.
Yeah, Garcia, a victim of MS-13, was sent to a prison system, CECOT, known to house MS-13 members. It's horrifying.
Do we know why IC hit him up in the first place, if it was an error?
The alleged reasons cited are just flimsy. Wearing a Chicago Bulls jersey, apparently, and having a tattoo.
That's it. That's grounds for deportation to El Salvador.
It highlights the potential for discriminatory or pretextual reasons being used in these operations.
This seems to lead directly into Abramson's most provocative argument, the return of the American slave trade. That's such a strong claim. What's the basis for it?
It is jarring. The core of the argument isn't about literal chattel slavery, obviously.
Right.
It's about the U.S. government's actions, particularly in refusing to correct errors like Garcia's and asserting that once someone is deported, they are effectively under El Salvador's complete ownership.
Like property.
That's the analogy. By saying the U.S. has no more control or responsibility, even for someone wrongly deported, it implies a transfer of, well, ownership and responsibility.
And there might be financial incentives, too.
That's part of the argument. The U.S. potentially saves money on detention, housing, processing, trading people for cost savings or political convenience.
And for U.S. citizens under the BOP deal.
The fear is their sentences could just be unilaterally changed to life in CECOT with zero recourse through the U.S. legal system.
Because the administration says U.S. courts have no power once someone's on the plane.
That's the reported stance. Once they leave U.S. airspace, jurisdiction is lost. It creates a pathway to make people vanish into a foreign system. That's the crux of the slave trade analogy, treating people as disposable commodities.
And this whole situation seems connected to what the source calls the Venezuelan hoax. What was that about?
Right. The administration pushed this narrative really hard that the 238 Venezuelan migrants they deported to El Salvador were dangerous criminals, terrorists, the worst of the worst.
To justify the deportations.
Seems likely. Portraying them as a major threat to national security.
But was it true?
Not according to a CBS News investigation cited by Abramson. They found 75% of those deported Venezuelans had zero criminal record. None in the U.S., none in Venezuela.
75% had no record.
Correct. Attorney General Pam Bondi's defense of the deportations was described as, well, incoherent and factually wrong.
So the hoax was manufacturing a crisis.
It appears that way. Perhaps to justify the broader deportation agenda, maybe even lay groundwork for invoking something extreme like the Insurrection Act, claiming a Venezuelan invasion.
And Garcia's wrongful deportation might have resulted from this.
It seems very possible. A direct consequence of rushed, error-prone ICE operations potentially driven by this false narrative.
It's also really concerning how the term terrorism is being used more broadly now.
Yes, that's a very worrying trend highlighted in the analysis.
How so?
The Trump administration has increasingly labeled political opponents, even people involved in vandalism, like against Tesla cars, as terrorists.
Why is that so alarming in this context?
Because if you can label your political opponents or minor offenders as terrorists, it potentially creates a pretext under these Trump-Bukele agreements to, well, exile them to El Salvador.
Oh, wow.
Elon Musk has amplified similar rhetoric, reportedly wanting to see Democratic activists jailed for terrorism. It feeds into this danger.
And there was a deadline related to this.
Yeah, an April 20th deadline mentioned for a recommendation on invoking the Insurrection Act, specifically linking immigration and terrorism. It raises fears of extreme measures based on these stretched definitions.
What about the Supreme Court? Have they weighed in? Have they put a stop to any of this?
Well, their role has been complex and perhaps concerning. Their decision not to intervene in that case of the 238 Venezuelan migrants was seen by the administration as basically a green light.
A validation of their tactics.
Exactly. That's when Pam Bondi floated that air and soil theory. Once you leave U.S. airspace, our courts can't touch you.
Did any justices push back?
Oh, yes. Justice Sotomayor wrote a powerful dissent, warning explicitly about the danger of exiling people, especially citizens, and called the court's inaction a serious error.
What about in the Garcia case? Did the Chief Justice do anything?
Chief Justice Roberts did issue a temporary stay at one point in Garcia's case, But his reasoning was interesting.
How so?
He acknowledged irreparable harm might occur, but framed it as harm to the U.S. by being forced to bring Garcia back.
Harm to the U.S., not harm to Garcia.
It raised eyebrows. Whose interests were being prioritized? Bukele's political standing versus the life and rights of a wrongly deported U.S. resident.
It sounds like the administration believes they're above judicial review in these areas.
There certainly seems to be a belief within the administration, according to Abramson, that presidential power in foreign policy and counterterrorism trumps the courts.
And Trump and Bukele were planning to meet.
Yes, a meeting reportedly scheduled for April 14th, suggesting they're coordinating their strategy on all this.
The source material also connects this to the Great Replacement theory. How does that fit in?
Right, the GRT. It's that false conspiracy theory promoted by figures like Elon Musk.
That claims Democrats are deliberately using mass immigration to replace the existing electorate.
Precisely. It's a dangerous, faceless theory. But it's being used, according to the analysis, to demonize political opponents.
How? By linking them to this supposed plot.
Yes, and then labeling them as terrorists for supposedly enabling this replacement.
Which, again, could make them candidates for exile under the Bukele deals.
That's the fear. It blurs legitimate political difference with fabricated national security threats. It's insidious.
And they mentioned this isn't happening in a vacuum. There's other aggressive foreign policy stuff going on.
Correct. Like the recent ultimatum issued to Iran over its nuclear program. Potential military action there.
So the El Salvador situation is part of a bigger picture.
It seems to be part of a wider context of assertive, maybe even destabilizing foreign policy moves by the administration. It underscores that these agreements could have really unpredictable, far-reaching effects.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, which has been, frankly, quite alarming.
It has.
What are the absolute key concerns, the main takeaways we should be holding on to from Abramson's analysis?
I think the most critical points are, first, the very real possibility the U.S. is engaging in something that looks disturbingly like a modern form of human trafficking.
Okay, what else?
Second, the clear erosion of basic due process rights for people being deported, and that includes legal residents, potentially even U.S. citizens.
Conditions in CCOT?
Third, yes, the documented inhumane conditions inside Sikhikat. That's undeniable.
Then fourth?
And fourth, this deeply troubling expansion of the term terrorism to potentially include political opposition, creating a pathway for exile.
It really gives you pause. When you consider everything we've discussed today, what does it suggest about where things are heading? For individual rights, the rule of law, America's place in the world.
It forces us to ask some really fundamental questions, doesn't it? About our national values. What do we stand for?
Yeah.
It challenges our ideas about sovereignty, about universal human rights, about the limits of executive power, especially when it bumps up against foreign policy.
It feels like a critical moment.
It absolutely does. Staying informed, thinking critically about all this, and talking about these issues seems more vital than ever right now.